Welcome to In Conversation, folks. We come to you from Washington, D.C. My name is Ramesh
And I'm Aastha Verma.
You got to give credit to President Obama. The nuclear security summit went without a hitch. 40 heads of states were here. No one threw no shoes at no one. And of course, a lot of good news came out. The communique was very good. I liked the message that they gave. We want to secure the nuclear material, not from one country to another, but from the terrorists getting to some of that material. And I thought he handled himself well. Lots of good news.
Yeah, he's on a roll. I think President Obama needed several successive wins, so he got the first one with health care.
Yes.
And this is the second big one. I think this is going to be more recognized internationally, obviously, for the impact. But you had a couple of key things come out of this. One, President Obama showed that he can work with Russia. The Russian president, Medvedev, I hope I said that right, he was here. And they both agreed that, together they need to neutralize Iran, which is the first time I think Russia has ever come out and said something so bold. You had Ukraine basically say it was ready to give up its nuclear arsenal material, basically, so that it was in safer hands, or at least they were doing away with it completely. But most importantly, I think the president put out there that the threat isn't from countries attacking each other anymore, the way it was during the Cold War. Now it's about terrorist cells getting to this material and launching attacks wherever. I mean, you've now seen terrorism on a global scale, not just here in America. So this is a global concern.
Now, take a look at this picture, folks. Some of these guys he actually invited to the White House to talk to them. Let's talk about Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Trade between the two countries has really been taking off, folks. You can see foreign minister coming in almost once every 3 months, the defense minister, and so on and so forth. Even the prime minister, every 6 months he's here, which is a good sign that there's a business together.
That and Tim Geithner was in India. Many people it wasn't in the news very much, but he was there. One more example, I think, of the U.S. trying to make sure that economically it keeps its ties with India. I think in part because of China. China is such a dominant player in our part of the world that by forging an alliance with India, which has still 1 billion people and it's still an emerging market, it's actually doing quite well in comparison to other countries that still haven't come out of the recession. India is, doing still fairly well. And I think Tim Geithner and President Obama know that down the road, that alliance is going to be very valuable.
India has no ambitions to control the world like China may have, but that probably gives everyone an incentive to work with India. These Commonwealth Games that are going to come in, I hope they're able to make a very good impression. People are still scared.
They need to. I think at this point, India has been thrown the gauntlet, and it needs to respond. After China's Olympic ceremony, if it's going to try to make an impression in the world, this is their opportunity. They're never going to be center stage quite the way that they will be during those games. And if they do that well, I think then the Olympic Games is just a matter of time them to come to India. The Post did a nice story over the weekend about 5 myths people have about China. We keep thinking of it as like this large power in the East that's someday going to take over the world. Well, maybe, but they're not going to get there anytime soon. So I just thought I would share the 5 myths and why the author thought China, while powerful, is still not going to rule the world quite yet. First myth, China will quickly overtake the United States as the world's most powerful economy. Well, that's not quite true. They're growing extremely fast, and because they have 1.3 billion people, their economy just by volume is quite large. And if you compare it to the U.S., it's large, but it's still not that large. If you think about it, it's still barely 1/3 the size of the U.S. economy, which is $14 trillion. So, it's nowhere close if you compare it to the U.S. The second myth is that China, holds so much of our debt that they can hold Washington hostage. Well, that's not exactly true either.
No.
And the reason for that is, if you think about it, yes, China has a lot of money to lend, but there's only so many countries in the world that are actually big enough and have their own economy large enough to serve as a bank to China's credit.
Yep.
And the U.S. is the only such country in the world. So what it tells you is that it's a symbiotic relationship.
Yes.
It's not as if one really controls the other. They really need each other. So, China needs a place to put its money where it can hope to recover the losses.
By the way, we owe more money to Japan than to China.
Well, exactly. And so, again, to show you that China's coming up in the world, but, we shouldn't get so ahead of ourselves. Another myth, China's hunger for resources is sucking the world dry. Well, this is legitimate because of how big they are as a nation. And it's also true that China is the biggest producer of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. But again, if you compare it by volume to the United States, China only consumes 8 million barrels of oil a day. That's really not a lot considering how big they are. The U.S. in comparison consumes 20 million barrels of oil a day. So again, we're just much larger than they are.
I was reading the other day that the ships that carry the iron ore from Australia and South America, they are lined up on the docks of China, and some of them will stay there for 60 days before they're unloaded. That's how much they're importing.
I do think that this is something we need to watch. This is a trend that needs to be followed. But again, the U.S., becomes a case of the pot calling the kettle black. We can't look at China and accuse them of these things because we ourselves are the world's largest consumer of those very same resources. And then finally, the last myth is that China's economy has grown mainly through cheap labor. Well, again, the author makes an important point, is that China, India is very much the same way, in the beginning, because there is so much labor, there are so many people and it's cheaply available, you rely on that as a way to keep your economy running and moving. But as soon as there's an economic boom or growth, then as soon as you have the very first people with the ability to spend freely, then all of a sudden that labor becomes more expensive over time. And it's happening. It's happening in China and in India. Clearly, a lot of businesses in the U.S. are already feeling that because they're not outsourcing quite as much to India or to China anymore. It's actually cheaper to do it elsewhere in other parts of the world. So I think, in the beginning that cheap labor helps, but as they go through their economic spin, they have the same problems we do. They have a very stratified demographic base, and that demographic base over time isn't cheap.
If you're an American, you got to be proud. We started with Germany, we built Europe, then we built Japan. Japan used to be cheap labor. Then Japan moved up, went to South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, then India, China. I mean, we are
Brazil.
Raising the world's
Standards.
Mexico, NAFTA, we are raising the world's standards. So as an American, you got something to be proud of there.
Well, speaking of jobs, jobs at home is a concern because, yes, we are helping the world, but what about jobs at home? The unemployment numbers are still high, and they haven't really fallen. So I was reading an interesting article out of Time magazine about where the jobs are and where they will be. Now, it's not surprising, some of these numbers here, but, the fact that by industry, by segment, where those jobs are, it was pretty interesting to me. The largest segment